or in Malaysia, the movement control order is over, firms, companies would no doubt face situations whereby employees might be tested positive for the coronavirus, or perhaps they might be asked to be quarantined, for example. So in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 25 provides that everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services. So this is in Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So what this means is that firms must not only allow employees to seek treatment or to be treated for COVID-19, but also allow employees whose family members are affected or have been tested positive with COVID-19 to be allowed to take care of these members. They cannot be punished or discriminated in any way because they either have been tested positive for coronavirus or a family member has been tested positive. So there cannot be any discrimination or sort of punishment on these people. It also means that firms should not force employees to go on annual leave or unpaid leave because they have been affected by COVID-19. And as far as possible, firms, companies should make provisions for employees to work from home in today's situation. I mean, it might not be possible in all circumstances. I mean, that particular employee might not be doing work which allows him to be at his home, for example. But as far as possible, you need to allow or make provisions to allow for these employees to do so. And we must also consider the health of other employees, not just the employees who have been affected by COVID-19. So companies should make it a strict policy even after the lockdown is over, or even after the MCO, the Movement Control Order in Malaysia, is over. Must make it a strict policy for those who have traveled outside of Malaysia to disclose and make a declaration to the company. And in such situations, they should, in all circumstances, be asked to quarantine themselves for at least 14 days and work from home. So this is to ensure that other employees are not exposed to COVID-19. We have had a situation in Malaysia where apparently a person went to Italy, I believe, and came home, came back to Malaysia, did not self-quarantine, did not make any declaration, and subsequently that person, that employee in that company had infected another employee, and that employee's family, I think they had like 2 or 3 deaths already from that family. So all this, I think, apart from government regulations, companies need to make sure and to enforce a strict policy that you must declare that you have been to other places outside of Malaysia or outside of your country. So this is, of course, certainly once the MCO is lifted or any lockdown is lifted and people are allowed to travel again. Firms should also consider that employees at the lower end of the company hierarchy will be more affected when you talk about crises such as this, will be more affected than those at the higher end. So in view of this, companies that can afford to do so should consider providing financial assistance to those earning less to assist them in the treatment and perhaps to cushion the blow. They might not be adversely affected in terms of their own wages in the company, for example. But if it is a family member and that family member is working and their wages are affected, then perhaps some financial assistance from the company, if you're able to afford it, can assist. So this is all in situations where people who are at the lower end of the hierarchy in the company would be more affected in terms of the COVID-19 crisis. So that's for health. Now, the second human rights issue that I like to focus on, as I mentioned earlier, is in terms of employment. And this is the second most important aspect when we talk about employment. When we talk about COVID-19, which is employment. And Article 23 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights talks about how everyone has the right to work, the right to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. So employment and protection against unemployment is also a human right. When we talk about COVID-19, of course, apart from the health issue, the second biggest aftermath that countries have to deal with is, of course, widespread unemployment. There are certainly competing interests when it comes to this. If a company is struggling, of course, sometimes you might not be left with any choice or little choice than to let go of your workers. So these are interests which you have to weigh. And at the end of the day, if you're not able to do it, of course, I mean, you are not able to do it at the end of the day. But you may also be forced to perhaps reduce the salaries. So at the private sector level, I think it's a bit more difficult to ensure that people keep their jobs, and it does require government intervention, and that's why we're looking at all over the world, countries dealing with the COVID-19 crisis by giving out wage subsidies, incentives to corporations, and so on and so forth. In Malaysia, the government has recently, I think about 2 days ago, announced measures to assist small and medium enterprises, and eligible firms can take advantage of this, especially the wage subsidy, where the government will actually be paying a certain amount of wages in order to ensure that you do not let go of these companies. The authorities in Malaysia have said that you cannot basically cut salaries during the MCO. And while from a human rights standpoint, this is absolutely the correct position. The Employment Act, our Employment Act in Malaysia, talks about pay for work done. So it's not quite as straightforward as what the government puts it up to be. So legally, there are arguments as to whether you can actually cut pay and so on and so forth. But of course, from a human rights standpoint, you should not be doing that. So as far as possible, employers should ensure that they keep their workers. That could be done, as I mentioned, through utilizing the government incentives or by other means. There is also the issue of discrimination. When crises such as this occur, as I mentioned earlier, the most vulnerable are usually the hardest hit. And usually the ones at the lower rung of the hierarchy would be let go first, especially if, say, for example, they are on contract and so on and so forth. So this can perpetuate the inherent inequalities within society, where the less fortunate will be more affected by COVID-19. So firms should look at how to avoid this, and perhaps so-called extreme measures, such as cutting the salaries or incentives of the management, instead of letting go of employees, might be one way to go about it, to ensure that everyone's job is kept. Of course, again, like I said, there are competing interests in this, but if the management can show that they are together with the employees in going through these very hard times, I think it goes a long way to building trust. So that's in terms of employment. And last but not least is the issue of information. Now, usually when we talk about COVID-19, the right to information is not usually the focus, but the right to information is a basic human right. And Article 19 of the UDHR talks about how everyone has the right to freedom of opinion expression, and this right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers. The Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has actually issued a guideline and guidance with regards to human rights and COVID-19. Of course, this guidance is not specific for the private sector, but it's quite useful. But in the guidance, it talks about information, how information is crucial in combating COVID-19. So in the private sector, this right to information also exists, and firms, as far as possible, should make known to employees all the government statements, circulars, measures which have been taken, especially regarding their rights as employees. Sometimes perhaps employers might not want to make known these things because they might feel that it might be used against them. But I think there's no drawback to an employee. I mean, employers should be given all the necessary information about how COVID-19 is being handled, what sort of rights they have, and so on and so forth. So all these things should be shared with the employees. Firms should also be open and transparent about the measures which they are taking to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. So every step that companies take, every step that the management take should be communicated to the employees, and employees should be given reasons as to why these steps are being taken. And this is important. I've had situations, I've had people coming up to me asking for advice about their employers, or telling them that, oh, we're doing this, we're doing that, but not actually explaining why is it that these are being taken. For example, in terms of salaries, some companies just tell their employees that we are cutting 15% of your salary without actually explaining the reasons why this is being taken, why this is necessary, and so on and so forth. So the communication must take place between management, between the employer and the employee in times of crisis, so that they know and they understand from where the employers are coming from, and so that it's easier for them to accept it if it is necessary. And of course, at the end of the day, as I mentioned as well, it is their right as well to be informed, to receive information about these measures.
Thank you, Shah.
Yeah.
Sorry to cut you a bit short. We'll hold that thought. I think that's very interesting, the fact that you put on human rights from an information perspective.
Yeah. Okay.
We will park questions. We'll leave some time for the questions on that. We'll move on to the second presenter, Professor Saul J. Takashi. But before that, as you can see, we've already had some questions on our Slido deck. Please do contribute more questions. Do vote for your most the ones that you like the best, so that we can ask during the Q&A session. So Professor Saul J. Takashi. Saul J. Takashi is a professor of human rights and peace studies at Osaka Jogakuin University in Osaka, Japan. His fields of expertise include international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international refugee law, with research interests including business and human rights in Palestine, global Islamophobia, and the rights of Muslims in Japan, and in several European countries. Saul speaks frequently on these issues, including as a panel speaker at the Kuala Lumpur Summit in December 2019. Professor Saul, over to you. We can't hear you.
Yeah, it says.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. Now we can hear. Yeah, yes.
Now
Okay.
it works. Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity. As you can see, I have a very comfortable office here, so working from here is absolutely no problem. But I do have some slides, and I will move over to those in a second. As a matter of fact, I will do it right now. And thanks very much for the first presenter, which was really, I think there's a lot of synchronicity between what I'd like to talk about as well. I'm not so technically savvy, but let me just try to do this. Well, okay. Now I hope, does everybody see the slide?
Yes.
Is everybody seeing the slides? Okay, good.
Yes.
Because we don't have too much time, I'm really going to try to focus really on very similar issues, but build a little bit more sort of on the international standards and as pertains to how businesses should be conducting themselves in this time of crisis and in general. One thing, and I'm sorry that this the slide is a little bit it's a little bit small, so it's not as clear as it might be. But one thing that I think everybody understands here, because everybody here is a member of the Global Compact, these are of course, the 10 principles of the Global Compact, and of course everybody knows that the first 2 principles of the 10 are about human rights, and anybody who studied law knows that the things that come in the beginning are, of course, always looked at as the most important ones. So and that has also been reiterated many times, that the first 2 of the global principles, the Global Compact principles, being about human rights, just is a recognition of their importance and of how important human rights are to businesses. So what exactly does it mean? It says, when you look at principle number 1, and it says businesses should support and respect the protection of internationally recognized, internationally proclaimed human rights. So what exactly are we talking about here? Everybody, I think a lot of people have sort of a general idea of what human rights are, but what exactly does this mean for businesses, and what exactly do businesses have to do? Well, and forgive me if a lot of you already are very familiar with these, but the UN has actually adopted a set of principles that lay out in pretty specific ways what exactly businesses have to do for this. And those are the UN Guiding Principles, as it says here, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, also called the Ruggie Principles, after the person who was the main driving force in preparing the principles, Professor John Ruggie, who's in Harvard in the United States right now. It took him actually 6 years to prepare these, prepare the principles. It's a long story, and we don't have time to go into exactly how they came about. But there was a very long process of stakeholder consultation, 6 years, that Ruggie and the staff working for him went through to draft and prepare these principles for adoption by the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. And it's important to stress that, because over those 6 years, the stakeholders that were consulted, they consisted not only of human rights NGOs and people who represent victims of human rights abuses and that kind of thing, but also, of course, national governments and large corporations. So multinational corporations were very much involved in the preparation of these guiding principles. And it's fair to say that the sector of multinational corporations really were on board with this. This was something that everybody could agree to, and everybody did accept as something which they could live with and they could implement. So it is important. It's not something that just came from the UN, came out of the blue, came out of the sky, and we're marching around telling businesses what to do. No, that's not how this came about. So they were adopted, the Ruggie Principles were adopted by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011. And this is really the sort of the gold standard, the international standard for all businesses on human rights responsibilities. They're not a treaty, which means for lawyers that they're not a binding document. They're not binding as such. And there's all this, there's academic debate and all these debates about how businesses and private actors fit into the whole sort of scheme of international law in general. But that's not really the point here. I mean, the point here is that businesses have all agreed that this is something that they can implement. Businesses have signed up to these principles, and businesses, they recognize how important they are for sustainable business. So that is very important. And in fact, the Global Compact, together with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN Human Rights Agency, they've actually issued a guidance note that say very explicitly that this is something which all members of the Global Compact, by virtue of their membership of the Global Compact, this is something that they have to take seriously. They have to implement. It's an authoritative framework that businesses in the Global Compact really have to abide by. So it's an important document, and we don't have time to go through it in great detail today, but I definitely encourage everybody to look them up. In very, very quick terms, these are the 3 pillars of what the guiding principles talk about. So the first one is organizational commitment, meaning that businesses should have a human rights policy, and they should make that, within that policy, they should also have a very clear implementation structure. Second, and this is in many ways probably the most important one, certainly it's a very important one, and this is human rights due diligence, meaning that businesses should conduct due diligence on human rights before they start new operations, during the time that they are doing all their operations, and also as a sort of follow-up after at all sorts of regular intervals. So these are the kind of these are similar to the kind of risk assessments that a lot of corporations are already doing, but it's very important to recognize that this due diligence is about risks to human rights. They're the risks to human rights holders. So they're not the risks to the company. The reason that that's important is because if you approach this whole thing with the perspective of what are the risks to the company, then you start thinking in terms of, these rights violations, if they occur, they're very serious, but maybe we can sort of smooth things over by making sure that they don't become public. Or these rights violations, they could be very serious, but the chances of them occurring are kind of small, so let's sort of forget about them. And that's not the kind of perspective that is being called for here. It's the risks to rights holders, not to the company as such. And the third one is establishing an effective remedy. So this is sort of like a building on the kind of hotlines and complaints procedures that companies already have. But what's really important is to make sure that people can have access to these procedures, not just in terms of, so it's not we're not just looking at employees of the company, but everybody who works, for example, in the supply chain, and also their families, residents of people, people working near, people living near factories, that kind of thing. And also it's important to make sure they have access in terms of language. And throughout this whole thing, if you look at the yellow sort of exploding thing on the right, throughout this whole thing, and this has already been mentioned, it's important to take every step on the basis of very, very effective stakeholder engagement. So what this means is making sure that people are consulted. So that means workers, labor organizations, unions, but also, for example, organizations of residents that live perhaps nearby factories or nearby business establishments. Also, people, for example, human rights NGOs who may be operating in the area. Maybe they have their views as to what should be done from the human rights perspective in any kind of specific issue. What's important here again is we in the business and human rights field, we always use this word stakeholder, and I think it's probably because it's the kind of word that many corporate people use as well. And so it's important to use the same language, and that's fine. But of course, the shareholders are also stakeholders. The CEO of the company is also a stakeholder, but those aren't really the kind of stakeholders we're talking about here. That's not to say that they aren't important, but to ensure the human rights perspective, what's important is to look at the rights holders. So the workers, the residents that nearby, those kind of people, how are they potentially affected by business operations? And how can we make sure that there are no negative effects, no negative ramifications from the business operations towards human rights? That's really the kind of thing that we're looking at here. I have, what's going on here? Good, okay. I have, for each principle, I have a slide for, what they mean in practice, but we don't really have the time to go through them all in any kind of great detail. And anyway, there's a lot of synchronicity with what's already been said. So we'll just sort of skip over these ones. Human rights due diligence, of course, very, very important. Questionnaires are not enough. And again, the cooperation with stakeholders, with rights holders, is really what's key. It's not that companies go in and sort of, make their own assessment in any kind of in closed rooms and behind closed doors. What's important is done in an open and transparent way together with stakeholders. The effective remedy, this is something which is, which a lot of companies have a little bit of difficulty sort of getting their heads around and figuring out what it really is about. It's based on the assumption that there's no such thing as 100%. So there's no country where 100% there are no human rights violations. And it's the same with any company. Multinational corporations in particular, huge operations spawning over countries all over the place. And there's no such thing as a company where there are no risks of human rights abuses. It's just not possible. And these things happen. So the important thing is not to sort of pretend that these things don't happen, but to make sure that when they do happen, that the company management finds out about them as quickly as possible and is able to deal with the problem in as swift a manner as possible before the problem gets bigger, before it gets out of hand, before it goes all over the world of social media. You get the idea. So, when you look, I've dealt with a lot of Japanese companies who, they come to me, they're very proud and they say, oh yeah, we have a hotline for employees. And we're really proud to say that last year there were no complaints at all. So it shows that everything is perfect in our company. And so I say, well, that's not a good sign. That's actually a dangerous sign, because it shows that I think a lot of people, either they don't know about the complaint procedure, or they don't want to use it because they're afraid it doesn't work, or they're afraid of reprisals or whatever. And so we sort of unpack all these kind of things, and we find out a lot about where the shortcomings are for these remedy procedures that they have. And there are quite a lot. So anyway, really, we don't have too much time to go into great detail. But these, in closing, I just wanted to put some suggestions as to what businesses should be doing during the current crisis on the basis of the REGI principles. And there's a lot of synchronicity, I think, with what has already been said. Worker safety, for sure. Work health and safety should definitely be the top priority. And I listed as a bad example Amazon. I think perhaps some of you have seen some of the press coverage and what's been going on in Amazon in a number of different sort of distribution centers. I think in particular in the United States right now. Amazon, as far as we know, has really failed to take any kind of serious precautions to make sure that the virus does not spread in its distribution centers. People are unable to take off work, even if they feel, they start getting coughs and they start getting fevers. People are unable to do that because there's no sick leave. And people who have raised concerns have been fired. I think this took place in the state of New Jersey in the United States. So, these kind of things, and there have been, I think Amazon has really been sort of caught on the back foot as to what's been going on. And as has already been said, what's really important is to make sure that labor organizations, unions, and all sorts of rights holder organizations are involved in the kind of decisions that have to be made. Again, I would just repeat what's already been said about making sure that employees, if business establishments, for example, have to be shut down temporarily, it's really important to make sure that employees don't lose jobs, that they don't lose their income through this kind of measure. And it's also very important, and this is very, very key, a lot of companies try to do their best for their formal employees, but they sort of forget about the people who are being employed on a more irregular basis. So temps, for example, a lot of migrant workers are employed in an irregular fashion. So, for example, some of them have short-term contracts, some of them don't have contracts at all. Some of them are employed through various different temp agencies, that kind of thing. So this is the kind of thing that we want to make sure are not neglected. Everybody who works physically at or in any way is connected with the employer really should be treated fairly and justly. That's the idea. This has also already been said, be open with information. It's very, very important. And I can give you many, many stories about some of the companies that I've worked with, Japanese companies who this really is not in their DNA in many ways. And I can understand. It's, a lot of times you're looking at corporate information, which if I think there's a natural reaction in a lot of corporate boardrooms to think, but if our competitors know about these kind of things, what are they going to do? And we're going to lose out. And that's understandable. But it really is the time to be really open with information as much as possible, because people need to be informed as to what's going on and what sort of decisions, not only what sort of decisions have already been taken, but why decisions are being reviewed and looked at, and what decisions might be taken, because it's important that rights holders have an input into that decision-making process. Now, all of this, I think a lot of people in corporate boardrooms and in senior management, they look at all these kind of things and say, yeah, but we're going to go out of business. How are we going to do this? That's easy for you to say, Saul. I mean, a lot of people have said that kind of thing to me many times. But it is in this kind of time of crisis, what's happening, you see in many countries, is industry is getting together. They're banding together and asking for help from the government, because this kind of thing really can't be done. This can't be done in a piecemeal way, and it can't be done by just one or two companies, because in this kind of global competition, that really it's not fair. So what has to be done is everybody has to be together, not only with the rights holders, but also with the government, and to make sure that the government does its part to provide aid and assistance so that human rights can be respected. Okay, well, that's pretty much it. I just want to advertise some of my books here, and that's it from me. And I'm certainly happy to discuss these matters further.
Thank you, Prof. Saul. Very interesting perspective. Maybe we can offer the best question, a signed copy of your book. So if we look at the Slido now. We have a number of very interesting questions, and now we've come to the Q&A part of this. Let's start off with quite an interesting and most voted question to both panelists. Is ensuring human rights worth it if it leads to an economic crisis? Your thoughts and opinions, please.
I think maybe Professor Saul can start.
Can we unmute Prof, please?
Okay, maybe.
Okay, all right, now it works.
Now it works. Okay.
There was a thing that it didn't work. Okay, sorry about that. Well, I definitely don't want to talk about this for 90 minutes. Of course I could, but a lot of times these kind of things are posed as an either-or thing. It's either we respect human rights, or we work for the development of the economy. And I really don't think these are either-or questions. We can work for sustainable development while at the same time respecting human rights. And in fact, to make sure that any kind of economic development is sustainable, it has to respect human rights. That's something which is, that's really much the consensus now. That we can, things cannot be sustainable in the long term, even in the midterm, unless there is adequate protection for human rights. That's my answer.
And of course, I would also agree with that. And I think this whole crisis has actually exposed the inherent inequalities in global society now. And how people who are more vulnerable are more affected with the crisis. We see how the response to homeless people, for example, how is it that in this crisis we can actually find shelter for them? when in normal times, they are not even looked at, and they're seen as a problem. But it's something which can actually be solved if there is will to do so. And I think it has exposed all these sort of inequalities within our society. And hopefully after all this is over, we need to take a good hard look at how we do things, and perhaps do things better. So I do think that it is worth it, and I agree with Professor Saul in his assessment.
Right, thank you. So the next question. So how can we persuade companies to upheld human rights actions beyond the bare minimum required by law? And is there a matrix or scoring methodologies that we can see these companies adhere towards human rights practices?
Well, I think, okay, maybe I'll just take the first part. I think this takes some time, and especially when you talk about human rights, people usually talk about a vertical sort of response, where is the state doing something or ensuring that human rights is being upheld. Usually, most of the time, people talk about that. People don't really talk about horizontal sort of human rights, where private entities and individuals must adhere to human rights standards. So I think the question actually is something which is related, in the sense that you should encourage companies to adhere to human rights by having this sort of matrix system in place. And I think this is, in Malaysia, we don't have that sort of initiative yet, but it might be something which is worthwhile to look at, where you might be rated not only in your other sort of fields, but also in terms of how human rights compliant you are, how sustainable you are, and that would actually encourage these companies. And of course, from a lawyer standpoint, I would say that litigation is one way to ensure that companies do comply with human rights standards, because the only if they don't want to comply, then there must be something to make sure, or to push them towards compliance. And litigation can do that. And once you have litigation and the courts set a certain standards, that becomes the norm. So that's another way to ensure compliance. But of course, not everyone is going to want to take that sort of route. And really, we shouldn't be encouraging. We should be encouraging people instead of forcing people to do that.
But Shah, just a follow up on that. Do you think Malaysian courts have a acceptable standard when it comes to human rights litigation processes?
It's getting better. I must say that it's getting better. I mean, compared to perhaps 10 years ago, there is a more better appreciation of human rights, especially the human rights standards which are already within our federal constitution, the Malaysian federal constitution. So there's a better appreciation of human rights standards, democratic principles, and so on and so forth. Like I mentioned in my earlier, it's still persuasive. Human rights principle is not binding over in Malaysia, but there's at least greater appreciation for these sort of principles. And I would say that if you take a public interest litigation now as compared to 10 years ago, you'd have a better chance of getting a favorable result from the courts.
Thank you. Prof, your thoughts, comments?
Yeah, thanks very much. Okay, good. One of the things that I think it's important, especially for businesses, to think about is how can respect for human rights actually be good for them, because it can be good for them. I mean, I think the sustainable development thing and the necessity of protecting human rights, that's already a pretty good argument and a pretty good reason. Very good reason why companies should do it, but it can also be very good branding for companies. I hesitate to say those kind of things because I'm not a marketing expert. I don't know too much about it. But if you look at, for example, one good example being Apple. If you go to the Apple website and if you scroll down, then there's a thing called there's a place to click on called supplier responsibility. And if you look at that, then there's a quite a good wealth of information of how Apple is doing its best to promote human rights and to make sure that all its suppliers also protect or respect human rights. The Japanese clothing brand, which I know is also very very popular in Malaysia, Uniqlo, also has, they're one of the more advanced ones on this topic in Japanese terms. They've publicized their first tier supplier list. And they, you know, they show, they've made public the suppliers that they buy from, in an effort to also encourage those suppliers to be more accountable to the public and to the consumers in terms of their human rights performance. And all of these kind of things, you know, Apple, Uniqlo, Coca-Cola is also another relatively good one. These, you know, they use this as part of their branding. You know, that I buy a Mac computer or an iPhone shows not only that you know, I think it's a good machine, but that it's, you know, that I'm in accordance with their stance on human rights. That's the kind of brand that they've been using. Of course, this doesn't mean that they're perfect. I mean, Apple, you know, there are human rights issues with a lot of things that with what Apple does, and a lot of issues have been pointed out with regards to Coca-Cola and Uniqlo. You know, this is an ongoing dialogue. It's an ongoing thing. It doesn't mean that these companies are 100% perfect in any way, but it doesn't have to be. You know, the point is that they've made a public stance saying we take human rights seriously. We're going to take human rights seriously, and we agree to be judged by our human rights performance. And I think that you know, companies more and more are getting on this, are coming to this realization. I'm thinking of you know, really, I can remember like 30 years ago, Japanese companies, if you talk to Japanese companies about the environment, you know, most of them would have said, they just have scoffed at you and said, the environment, yeah, that's something that, you know, the government worries about. You know, when the government makes a regulation, yeah, of course we'll abide by it, but it's not our problem. I mean, you know, we exist only to make money for shareholders and to create employment and to create wealth. That's our thing. And, you know, the environment, yeah, we don't really, it's not our thing. It's not something that we need to know about. But now it's almost impossible to find a Japanese product or a Japanese company which doesn't brand itself as environmentally friendly and green and, you know, all this kind of thing. And of course, you know, it's corporate branding. It's not too many companies, I think, outright lie, but I think, you know, it's branding, it's advertising and marketing, and, you know, there's that element to it. But it means that they recognize that it's important, that it's something that they should be judged by. So, you know, more and more, I think companies are coming to that kind of realization with regards to human rights as well. In Japan, the Olympics have been really key to this, in actual fact, which have been postponed until next year anyway. But anyway, that's a different thing. Now, with regards to matrices and how companies can measure their performance in sort of numerical ways, you know, being a lawyer, I'm sort of allergic to numbers, and I think most lawyers are. But there are a lot of tools available on the internet for this kind of thing. There is something called the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, which is an independent body that's made up of NGO. On the steering committee are NGOs, including the international NGO I used to work for, the Business and Human Rights Research Center, but also many corporate research institutions. And they have, you know, there's this long sort of framework of criteria and how people and how companies are numerically valued and how well they're doing. And this kind of thing is published every year. They do a set, and that's published of the top ranking companies, of course, but it's a framework that can be used. The second one that I would just throw out there is the reporting framework for the global principles reporting framework. And that's, again, if you search for that on the internet, you'll find that it's a tool that's being used more and more by the companies. All of these are, you know, they're voluntary. I mean, they're not something. The Corporate Human Rights Benchmark is something that this organization gets together and does together with the companies involved. But the reporting framework is something that companies that want to stress and want to, they want to measure their human rights performance, and they want to make it open, and they want to show people how well they're doing in human rights and where the areas that they have to work a little bit harder on. This is a whole voluntary thing. So if you look at on the Internet for the reporting framework, there are that's a tool which exists and which companies can use to measure their performance and to show people how they're doing.
Right. So we have I would say an internationally flavored question. What do you think of President Trump's response to COVID-19? And is he violating human rights issues? No worries, Chatham House.
Okay. Should I go first? You're putting me on the spot. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I as you can see, I spent my childhood in the United States, but I'm not an American citizen, so I can say whatever I want, and I will say whatever I want. Anyway, Donald Trump's response to the virus. Look, I don't know. I don't really know what to say about that, but certainly Donald Trump has been a human rights disaster for the United States and globally. Not just, which is not to say that the alternative would have been much better, but certainly Donald Trump is awful, and he's one of the big problems that a lot of Americans don't understand is, okay, just say Donald Trump loses the next election, just say he goes quietly, which I think is a big if, frankly, but just say that happens, and I don't know what the alternative is. Biden, I mean, if it's Bernie Sanders, that would be a great thing. But whatever's going to happen, it's going to be very difficult for any other country to take the United States seriously. And that's, I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing, but people have to understand this. The whole global order is changing in that regard, because even if a country enters into an agreement with the United States, and even if whatever president or whatever Congress there is, they agree to abide by it, 4 years down the line, there could be another Donald Trump. There could be somebody even worse. And so, Donald Trump sort of waltzes in and says, oh, yeah, the Iran nuclear agreement, what does that have to do with us? Oh, parasite, what do we care? That can kind of thing can happen. So no country all countries are going to think twice about taking the United States seriously. They'll take it seriously in the terms of, obviously, it's a big economic power and it will remain a military power. But until, this has done, really, really huge damage, and frankly, irreversible, I think, damage to the standing of the United States and what it purports to represent all over the world. Anyway, that was sort of my 2 cents about it. But certainly the human, what Donald Trump has done for human rights in the United States it's an extension of what's been going on for many years. It's not, he's more a symptom rather than a cause, but certainly he's exacerbating the situation with regards to the Muslim ban, so-called Muslim ban, with regards to refugees. It's been a complete disaster, of course, and democratic institutions in the United States, which frankly have always been pretty weak and pretty lacking, have been weakened even more. Sorry.
Shah, any thoughts?
I think it's just sad that, in times where we are really looking for some sort of moral beacon in these trying times, the US is not that beacon. And I suppose it hasn't been that beacon for a long time, but I think it's shown that, at least the government there is not really leading the way when it comes to how we should deal with this crisis in the proper manner, in the ethical manner, sustainable manner, and so on and so forth. So it's quite sad in that regard.
Just a follow-up on that. So, it kind of alludes to the fact that the government must play a leadership role to ensure, as you mentioned, a horizontal approach for human rights. In that, Brett, how do you think we can persuade the Malaysian regulators, especially the Bursa or SC, to make human rights a compulsory reporting mechanisms for companies in Malaysia?
I think the problem is that human rights advocates for the longest time have not really focused on this aspect of human rights. I don't see a lot of engagement between human rights advocates, human rights NGOs, and even Suhakam when it comes to these sort of things with the financial regulators, the SCs and the Bursas and so on and so forth. So I think more of those sort of discussion needs to take place, more of those sort of engagement needs to take place. And I think human rights needs to be in a way normalized in these institutions. You cannot just look at human rights as purely something which Suhakam needs to look at, or the KDN, the Ministry of Home Affairs need to look at. It must be something wider than that. And I think this is something which, again, there is a lot of improvement in terms of how people look at things over the past 10 years, past decade in Malaysia. But I think now at least we are talking about human rights, fundamental liberties in a more frequent manner. But we need to move towards a more comprehensive approach to human rights, and this is something I think the human rights advocates and of course coalition of NGOs and so on and so forth should look at moving forward.
Thank you. So we've come to the end of our 1 hour. Before we sign off, could I ask our speakers to share 1 minute your thoughts on human rights and COVID and how we can get through this together? Prof, you would like to summarize?
Okay. Yeah, sure. I mean, well, for sure, we'll get through this global crisis. And, you know, the question really is what happens afterwards. I think what one thing that, you know, society in general has to be very careful of, and also corporations have to be careful of, is that we should not be, this is the time that we really have to take human rights seriously. Because what's happening now, I think, is there's a potential for this state of exception, the state of emergency to become normal. And it's not normal. I mean, these kind of, you know, shutdowns of entire cities, shutdowns of entire countries, people are, you know, ordered to stay at home. People can't get together and talk or organize or, you know, protest or any of these kind of things. You know, maybe there are legitimate reasons for that right now in the immediate crisis, but it's we really have to be very mindful. This is not normal, and this is not the kind of thing that that should be going on forever. And it's the same with, you know, same with corporations, like we've been saying. You know, corporations should be mindful of human rights now, because what happens afterwards is going to make a big difference with how society looks like afterwards. Yes.
Shah, last thoughts?
Yeah, I think this crisis, and I think I agree with Prof. Sol, I think we will get through this crisis, that's for sure. But once this is over, there's going to be a new normal. And really, apart from the fact that, you know, the world is changing and so on and so forth, I think this crisis gives us the opportunity for us to look at how we do things. I mentioned earlier about, you know, how the homeless people in Kuala Lumpur now are being housed at a place, and I saw on Twitter that they're getting free haircuts and so on and so forth. Why can't these things be done during normal times, for example, before this, right?
Yeah.
So these are things which we can look at, and it gives us the opportunity in times of great sadness, in times of great frustration and crisis. It gives us the opportunity to relook at ways so that we can have a new normal, a normal which is better than what it was before.
Thank you, Prof. and Shah. Ladies and gentlemen, please do join me for a virtual applaud for our two speakers today. Before we sign off, could we ask everyone to this time, maybe if you can turn on your cameras for a group picture, so that we can keep this in memory with this very interesting session. So we'll give everybody maybe just 1 minute to get as many cameras turned on as possible while we figure out how we do this. Maybe this is the first time that we're trying to figure this out as well. Sharwin,
if you put it on gallery view, we can see.
Yeah.
More
yeah. Okay.
We can see everybody.
Okay. So
yeah.
Wait, on 3, yeah. Okay. So like I'll go with the first page and then the second page.
All right.
Okay. 1, 2, smile. Okay. 1 second. Okay. Second page. 1, 2, smile.
All right.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Shah and Prof. So now you know if you have some litigation cases, you know who to go. You want to sign a copy of a human rights book, you know who to contact. And we'll keep you updated with more webinars that we have in the pipeline. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you.
And stay safe, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thanks. Salam.
Salam.